Hey, it's Hawk with Topdon. Today we are going to do a video on a 2014 Dodge Ram 1500 EcoDiesel. The customer brought this vehicle into the dealer, and the dealer told them they need an SCR catalyst. Now, this is a very expensive repair, and so the customer brought it to this shop, 710 Diagnostics. Again, want to thank Mike Blackanieri for hosting us here. And we are going to look at this vehicle and see if we can either confirm the diagnosis that the dealer has provided or provide evidence to the customer that a different repair is needed, potentially a less expensive repair. So let's go ahead and get into the diagnosis. All right, so we're just going to take you through our initial setup here. We've got our Topdon T30,000 on the battery. We're making sure that when we're doing any key on engine off testing and or as we're doing any kind of prepping for a drive cycle, we want to make sure our battery is fully charged. And once we've done that, let's take you inside the vehicle here, and we're just going to show you what we see on the dash and why the customer brought this vehicle in. So if we go in here and we turn the key on, we'll see our glow light goes on, goes off, and we're going to start it for just a moment. And you're going to see, maybe we have to shut the door. Nope, there it is. Engine will not restart due to the DEF system not functioning correctly. So that is the reason why the customer brought this vehicle in, and that is what we're going to be troubleshooting today. All right, so we're going to get into the technical explanation and the testing that we performed in order to determine what the root cause of the message on the dash and the fault codes were for this vehicle. Now, again, we just want to go over that the dealer told this customer that they needed essentially a $5,000 repair to replace the SCR catalyst. That is a lot of money. And unfortunately, most customers do not have that kind of money laying around. So they asked us for a second opinion. So we went into this, and here is the additional testing that we did on this one. So we'll walk you through what we did, why we did it, and the information you would need to know if you run into a similar fault on a common rail diesel. Now, each common rail diesel is going to be a little bit different as far as the specific procedures that have to be carried out, but a lot of them will require some form of self-test, drive cycle, or something of that nature in order to put them back into service after they have a countdown message on the dash. So here are the initial pre-scan faults that we had. P2BA9, NOx exceedance, insufficient reductant quality, and P20E, efficiency below threshold for NOx, bank 1. Now, it's possible that these are related. It's possible that one causes the other. It's possible that we have two faults with the NOx reduction system. We don't know, right? We have some various things that we can do for basic troubleshooting and, of course, as well as testing. We can validate and reproduce these faults. So just keep in mind, one step you always want to do on any fault for any car is reproduce the fault. We need to prove when it happens, and we need to also be able to prove that it is reproducible. And of course, in this case, it was. Sometimes the vehicle would only set the one fault, sometimes it would set both. But at this point, it has both faults, so we're going to attack them one at a time. So there's a message on the dash here, and you can see there is a countdown basically saying, hey, there is an emissions related fault to the DEF system, and we are going to prevent you from starting the car if you do not fix this problem. So it is important to remember that because this is an emissions related fault, this kind of stuff can happen, and you can lose the ability to start a vehicle. Now, this vehicle is fully factory in stock. There's no modification of any kind. And we did find that during our drive cycle, we actually went all the way past the 47 miles, and the vehicle did still restart, which we thought was kind of strange. However, that may not be the case with a lot of other common rail vehicles. So take this message seriously. If this pops up on the dash, you most certainly do need to address it. You cannot just kick the can down the road and ignore it. So that's essentially what we're trying to resolve here, is that message, and of course any fault codes
related to that message. So we have that P2BA9 and the P20EE. We looked through our service information resources on a number of aftermarket service information websites and came up largely pretty empty. There was not a lot of information on either of these faults, and there definitely seemed like there should be because, well, A, we should at least have basic definitions and troubleshooting, and B, with a lot of stuff these days on a vehicle that is in excess of 10 years old, I would expect there to probably be some updates to the service manual or potentially even some bulletins. And in this particular case, the aftermarket websites were largely missing that. So we decided at this point that it was prudent to buy a subscription to the Stellantis Tech Authority website, which is available on a short-term subscription. And once we did that, we were able to find quite a bit larger volume of information. So we found this particular STAR bulletin, which contains a great deal of information about this P2BA9. This also points out that there were several bulletins released prior that covered this, or at least one, and that bulletin was also missing from these aftermarket websites, which I thought was pretty strange, especially considering this bulletin was released only 5 years after the vehicle was built. So if we look at this and read the highlighted text, this is the part we're really paying attention to here. When that fault trips the P2BA9, after you determine the root cause or you believe you've determined the root cause of that fault, you do in fact have to run a specialized monitor. The P2BA9 monitor is a specialized drive cycle and procedure. So this particular bulletin outlines what you need to do in order to satisfy that criteria. Now, they also mention a DEF tank filling procedure. So the vehicle does have to see a refilling event, essentially a change in level of the DEF tank, and they do get into detail about that so you know what you have to do in order to satisfy that criteria. But just keep that in mind. Again, you need to read that carefully so you understand what steps you have to do. Now, we'll talk a little more about that shortly here. So here's some information we found on the P20EE. Couple of different notes just about NOx sensor operation to keep in mind. And again, these are useful details that you want to keep in mind and kind of keep at the forefront as you're doing the rest of your testing. Basically talking about what the normal operation of these NOx sensors should look like and what some clues to possible abnormal or failing NOx sensors would look like. Here's additional notes here. These are also vital to keep in mind, and we'll talk a little more about this in depth a little later on when we discuss the drive cycle testing that we did. So because we have a generic fault in basically NOx reduction is insufficient, and we also have a DEF quality related fault code, one of the tests that we want to do here, and it's kind of a service procedure / a test, is clean the DEF injector, check the flow rate of the DEF injector, and also make sure that the DEF quality is meeting the standard required by the manufacturer, aka Stellantis. So you need a refractometer to test the DEF quality. You need to remove the DEF injector and clean it, which is actually a fairly simple procedure. And you also want to check the flow rate of the DEF injector according to the service information when you have that injector out for cleaning. It's a simple test to do while you are taking the injector out for cleaning. So we're not going to get into the nitty-gritty details on how to do that. The service information does give you clear directions on this, so you can certainly follow that. But these are prudent things that we would want to do if we have a DEF quality problem or fault, and if we have a reduction in NOx problem, because the DEF fluid is part of that process, that chemical interaction that helps reduce the NOx. So if we do not have good DEF quality and or delivery rate, we're not going to see the reduction in NOx that we need. So we did all this. The delivery rate was okay after we cleaned the DEF injector. There was some crystals on it, and that is pretty normal. This vehicle does sit for extended periods of time, so DEF quality could degrade if this vehicle sits for an extended period of time. So we did drain out some DEF, do a quality check. It passed the quality check. However, we still drained enough out and then added some fresh DEF back in just to verify that the vehicle would in fact recognize a refilling procedure had taken place so that we could then initiate the P2BA9 drive cycle. So now we need to know what the drive cycle procedure is. In order to do that, we're going to go back to that bulletin we were looking at before. Now, I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty details and explain it or talk it through. Just rest assured, if you go find this bulletin, you can read through it and you'll find the drive cycle procedure outlined in detail. There is one note here I want to point out, and there is a picture here that shows you a data PID display that the vehicle that Stellantis provides with the factory tool YTech 2.0. And as far as I know, YTech 2.0 is the only software that will provide this dedicated menu that shows you all of these very specific criteria for the P2BA9 drive cycle. So just keep that in mind, and we'll explain, what we did here for that. Here's some additional information about drive cycle B. So there's an A and a B drive cycle, and you do need to know specifically what the criteria are for each of them. Now, also note in the section after drive cycle B that if P2BA9 resets during drive cycle B, there's still an issue with the vehicle, right? So this is important to understand that this fault can signal there are other problems with the selective catalyst reduction system, or SCR system, and DEF system. So here's drive cycle A, here's drive cycle B. Each of these is for different stuff, and they do tell you not to cycle the ignition during either of these procedures. So again, that's just for your reference. You can easily go find this bulletin and have a grip on what is required. So what we decided to do at this point, after reading through the bulletin that said there's a very specific drive cycle, and there's clearly data PIDs that should be monitored and watched during the drive cycle procedures, we said, we had better purchase a subscription to the YTech 2.0 factory software. And of course, we have our R-Link Lite, so we can use that with the factory software in order to perform this test, carry out the procedure, and monitor the data. Now, it is important to keep in mind that there are a number of setup steps for YTech 2.0, including you do have to register your laptop with Stellantis, and that can take 24 to 48 hours, business hours, in order to do that registration. It's also important to remember that you do have to have internet connectivity while you are using the software, and that means throughout the entire session. So while you're executing the function on the tool, while you're monitoring the data, it does require that you have internet connection. So plan your test drive carefully and make sure it's not in an area where there's no internet. You're going to need a hotspot to your phone in order to make use of the software. So connect your laptop to your hotspot on your phone, and only then are you going to be able to carry this out. All right, so we've done all that. We've got it all connected, and we've got our subscription, and we have our R-Link Lite connected. So R-Link Lite is plugged into the DLC data link connector port. We have the laptop plugged into the R-Link Lite, and we have our laptop Wi-Fi connected via hotspot to our phone, and we have planned our test drive route accordingly to make sure that we will maintain an internet connection throughout the entire route. So now we boot up YTech and we have it up, and we're going to go to the topology screen. So I go to the topology screen first for a number of reasons here. The most important reason being is this screen gives you a lot of quick information. The little lightning bolt symbol that we see next to a module indicates that we have a software update available for a module. Now, you're like, well, why do I care? Well, if we're troubleshooting a fault, especially a fault that might be something where maybe we think it's erroneous judgment by the module, we might want to check and see if there's a software update to address that. Now, in many cases, we would find bulletins on this from the manufacturer that would say, hey, update the software to address this P20EE or whatever it might be. I will also tell you that this particular vehicle was at the dealer prior because, again, they told her to replace the SCR catalyst and a bunch of other stuff for $5,000. They did, in fact, update the software on the PCM. So we take note here that the PCM does not, in fact, have a lightning bolt by it, which indicates that, to the best of our knowledge, there is no update available for this PCM, and therefore software should not be a factor in our consideration for what's causing this issue. All right, so now we want to set up the drive cycle for the P2BA9. So we're going to go through YTech and show you how we did that. So the first thing we do is we go to the ECU list in the top left, we find the PCM and click the PCM. We go to miscellaneous functions, and then we click on Initiate P2BA9 SCR Refill Monitor. Pretty straightforward, right? Makes sense. So now here's the screens you're going to see after you hit that button, and I'll move my little bubble out of the way so you can see. So the first screen basically says, here's why you do this test. Okay. Second screen is basically, hey, warning, this could take an hour or maybe more. So be aware and plan accordingly. Good to know, right? If you have to go drive the vehicle for an hour or more, you'd like to know that. A, you want to know if you have enough fuel, and B, you also want to make sure that you don't have other things you need to get done before you embark on this journey. Or perhaps you're going to have a different employee drive this vehicle if you're at a shop, right? All right, so it is beneficial to warm the vehicle up prior to initiating this. Just keep that in mind. You can warm it up in the bay with an exhaust hose or out in the driveway or whatever it might be. You can let this thing warm up first, then initiate it. And again, remember we saw in the notes about the NOx sensors, they do have to be fully warmed up in order to read correctly. So we're going to hit continue, and then it's going to check a bunch of stuff and make sure that it's eligible to start this procedure. And then in the top here, it starts to initiate the monitor. And then on the bottom, we should get a message here that says it has been initiated. Now you have to go drive it. Now it will also tell you, if we go back a screen here, it does tell you that you have to start the procedure key on, engine off, not with the engine running. So just keep that in your mind. So now we've initiated it with the software, but we need to know where we need to go next in order to watch all of the necessary data. So I'm going to move my bubble again so you can see this. So we're going to go back over to the side menu here, and we are going to click on OBD monitors. Then we're going to click on OBD2, and then we're going to click on SCR Refill P2BA9. Now we also notice that this is a status 0. Remember, status 0 means it's not completed. Status 1 would be completed, right? So now we're going to click on the monitor data first after we clicked on the previous menu, and you'll see a bunch of pre-criteria saying whether or not these have already been satisfied. Most of these say false, right? But that's normal. We're not worried about this screen yet. We're going to actually change to the next screen over, which is the pre-test. So we're under OBD over on the left menu, OBD on the top menu, and pre-test here. The pre-test menu for P2BA9 has the screen that you see listed in the bulletin for P2BA9. So this is the screen we want to have up during our test drive, and we want to watch all of these data PIDs to make sure that they are properly changing based on what the drive cycle says and our driving pattern. If we follow the drive cycle and we read the TSB, we know what each of these is supposed to do. So we took it for this test drive, and we could not get it to complete any good monitoring events. And we thought this was kind of strange. And we did try drive cycle A and B both, and we could not get it to complete any good monitoring events. We got everything else to change successfully except for that. So we're like, this is interesting, right? So we came back and we cleared the faults, and then we rescanned it, and we still have another fault for P20EE. So we still have an efficiency problem. So we don't have the P2BA9 anymore, even though we didn't complete any good monitoring events. Now remember, we said the P2BA9 sometimes set and other times it did not. So clearly that's not necessarily a fault that's going to set 100% of the time on this particular vehicle. But we did get the P20EE to reset. So let's go back and re-examine the P20EE criteria and notes in that bulletin and see if we can find any other clues that might indicate what's going on with this vehicle. So we're going to go back, look at our bulletin again. Let's read this carefully. If we look at the highlighted section, we notice a couple of keys about the NOx sensor. Now, these are actually principles that would apply to most, if not all, common rail vehicles that have NOx sensors. An upstream and a downstream NOx sensor, their job is to report whether or not the SCR catalyst is actually reducing the NOx that is being expelled and traveling out to the tailpipe, right? So, during that process, the upstream NOx sensor is measuring the NOx that's being produced by the engine, and the downstream NOx sensor is validating whether or not the SCR catalyst is in fact reducing the NOx that is being generated. So if we read the notes here, we see during a zero throttle deceleration, both of the NOx sensors should read close to zero. Well, that makes sense because we're not producing NOx a bunch because we're not accelerating, and we are not stepping on the accelerator and causing more fuel to be injected, which is what would initially start the NOx generation process. So if we have a sensor reading above 20 parts per million, that's a criteria that could signal a flag or an issue with a sensor. There is also the secondary paragraph here where it says at no point during vehicle operation should the downstream, and again, that's the one that's after the SCR catalyst, that sensor should not read higher than the upstream. And that makes sense, right? You shouldn't have more NOx after the catalyst than you have before the catalyst. Now, if you have a sensor reading like that, obviously it could be the upstream sensor is reading erroneously, and so the NOx sensor downstream is reading correctly, or vice versa, right? We don't know. We have to look at the data and see what makes sense. Is it plausible or not plausible? Do we get it to flag any additional faults if we take it for another test drive? Just some additional things we want to keep in the forefront of our mind as we drive this vehicle some more. So here, you also see there's a note. P20EE do not list the NOx sensors as a possible cause of the DTC. Okay, really? So we outline a bunch of stuff about NOx sensor function, suggesting that we understand that the NOx sensor could in fact cause issues with the vehicle. Because, again, what was our definition? This was NOx exceedance, right? It's not reducing the NOx enough. Well, that could be erroneous reading, right? If one of the sensors is not reading the reduction correctly, well, then the computer could say, hey, you're not reducing the NOx enough, right? So again, a little strange there. But if we do look at, there's a few more notes here about the NOx sensors. So they go on and on and on about the NOx sensors, but they tell you that the NOx sensors aren't listed as a possible cause for this fault. Really? Okay, well, we're just going to take that with a grain of salt. But it does say that you do have to let the NOx sensors warm up before they will read correctly. Now, we did make sure we did this when we took it for the P2BA9 drive cycle, and we did do this during our additional test drive for diagnosis purposes. So we take it on another test drive. After clearing out the faults again, the message is still on the dash with the countdown. So we're going to monitor the live sensor data for NOx sensor 1 and 2. We're also going to add RPM in there so we can see if we're accelerating or decelerating. You might want to add APP sensor. We did not add that to our data, but that probably would be a smart idea. So we also have coolant temp just to make sure, hey, this vehicle has actually warmed up. Should be up to full operating temperature before we're evaluating any of this. And so we are, and sure enough, we catch NOx sensor 2 reading higher than upstream NOx sensor 1. Now remember, the P20EE bulletin explicitly told us, no, that is not okay. That's bad, right? Now, with any testing, we always want to make sure we can reproduce and duplicate our results. So on our test drive, we continue to drive, and sure enough, we can reproduce this fault multiple times. So NOx sensor 2 continues to read higher than NOx sensor 1 intermittently. So this appears to be a sporadic fault. We watch NOx sensor 2 and sometimes it seems to read correctly, sometimes it seems to read incorrectly. However, we can watch the NOx concentration of sensor 1 here and compare it to the engine speed, and there appears to be a fairly linear correlation between engine speed and NOx sensor 1. That would make some level of sense, right? Because NOx sensor 1 As we accelerate and RPM climbs and we push the APP sensor in, we're going to inject more fuel, more NOx is going to be generated, so we should expect that NOx to increase on sensor 1. It appears to be doing so. It appears to be mirroring exactly what the APP is doing, or pretty closely approximated. NOx sensor 2, on the other hand, seems to be kind of all over the place, right? Up and down and up and down and up and down and up and down in fairly dramatic fashion. Several hundreds of parts per million. We don't see nearly as much of a swing generally here in NOx sensor 2. It seems to be much more steady and linear. So this seems pretty likely that NOx sensor 2 is erroneous. Now, we also did catch NOx sensor 2 actually reading completely implausibly like below zero at times when we were on a zero throttle deceleration. And I did not add that screenshot to this, but that was another erroneous reading from the downstream NOx sensor, aka NOx sensor 1, 2, bank 1, sensor 2, just like an oxygen sensor terminology, right? So when we went for this other test drive and we were looking at that live data, lo and behold, we got the vehicle to flag a new fault code. Sure enough, we've got a P1289 NOx sensor, bank 1, sensor 2, in other words, the downstream sensor. The zero offset is too low. So we're going to go look up that fault code just to see what that means. See if we have any other additional notes. So here is the details about this fault. First check occurs when the exhaust temperature is above 302 degrees. Second check occurs when it's above 302 degrees and NOx value is changing. And the first one is when it's decel fuel cut, basically, right? So these are the two times when the PCM is checking to see if that NOx sensor 2 is doing its job correctly. And sure enough, we did in fact notice that NOx sensor 2 was not doing what it was supposed to do during both of these, right? So under a decel fuel cut, we saw that it was not reading correctly, NOx sensor 2, bank 1 sensor 2 to be specific. And we also saw that when the NOx value was changing, when we were accelerating, we were seeing NOx sensor 2 go like this, right? It was not steady. It was not responding in a similarly linear fashion to the accelerator pedal input like NOx sensor 1 was. So we have two clues here that say NOx sensor 2 is the bad guy, the suspect, right? And here is your set conditions on the bottom. So first condition, the sensor is not reading zero during decel and zero fueling for 2 consecutive trips. Now remember, trips, you need to know what a trip qualifies as, so that's something you might want to verify in your OBD readiness monitor discussion, and that's usually published information. Second condition, PCM has detected that NOx sensor is not changing with engine conditions. So in other words, it's stroking out and not moving, right? So if that happens, well, that would clearly indicate that it's feeding erroneous data. So we feel pretty comfortable at this point between, number one, cleaning the DEF injector, checking the quality, performing a refill event, making sure the delivery is sufficient, inspecting the condition of the SCR catalyst to make sure there's no damage or cracks or anything like that, checking all the other stuff in that general vicinity just to make sure the condition's okay. We felt that anything related to the DEF was resolved and okay. So we needed to verify that, well, is the dealer correct? Does it need an SCR catalyst or does it not? We found that no, it doesn't. It needs a downstream NOx sensor, bank 1 sensor 2, because it's reading erroneously. And this is what we believed to be the problem with the vehicle. Now, of course, if you have a defective sensor that's reading wrong, you would need to replace that sensor and then run any monitoring checks and readiness checks again just to verify. So at this point, we went down and checked bank 1 sensor 2. We checked for power and ground at the sensor. It has a private CAN network, and we did not scope the CAN network, but we did, because it has a CAN network that is shared with other sensors, if the CAN network itself was corrupted, we would be inclined to believe that something else on that private CAN network would likely be reading incorrectly or erroneously. Nothing else is, and that is shared with the other NOx sensor on this vehicle. So because it's a shared network and knock sensor 1 is reading correctly, we have no reason to believe that this is a network issue, a wiring on the network issue, or anything like that. We simply need to make sure that this has good power and ground. Load test the power and ground going to the knock sensor, and now we replace the knock sensor.
So at this point in time, what we need to do next is replace the downstream NOx sensor and then attempt the drive cycle procedure to try and put the vehicle back into normal operation mode. When we go through that drive cycle procedure, the vehicle will validate if there are other problems with the diesel emission system, and it will flag additional fault codes if in fact there are other problems with the system. But you can only attack one fault at a time as this vehicle triggers them during that specific drive cycle procedure. So that's our next step. All right, so we replaced the downstream NOx sensor and we ran the self-test drive cycle as required by the service information. And now we are able to put the vehicle back into operation. So in this particular case, our testing was able to narrow down that the initial recommendation by the dealer was incorrect. And we were able to save the customer quite a large sum of money here. So really being able to understand the system operation, leverage all of that service information and documentation, and of course, being able to have access to the appropriate tools using our Phoenix Lite 3 to look at the live data stream and do the graphing and everything, and then be able to use the YTech 2.0 tool in conjunction with our R-Link Lite allowed us to diagnose this vehicle efficiently and accurately. Again, it's so vital that you have access to the right resources in order to be able to fix a modern vehicle like this. You'll find problems like this on many common rail diesel vehicles. And again, the cost of an incorrect diagnosis can be rather expensive. So it's good that the customer brought this vehicle in for a second opinion. So I'm Hawken with Topdon, and thanks again for taking the time to watch our video. Please like, subscribe, and share, and we'll see you on the next video.